uh, a bit about myself first. I a very, very long time ago, trained in psychiatry, and then I became a clinical neurologist with a particular interest in terminal disease and end-of-life care. And I've studied the sort of neurobiological basis of things like empathy and love and happiness and other complex phenomena. I'm also a humanist. I officiated humanist funerals and some weddings. I'm also trained in non-religious pastoral care. That means sort of humanist chaplaincy. And as Neil said, my greatest claim to fame is that I'm a cousin, sort of Lisa Parkins. So what I'm going to talk about is partly evidence-based science, partly cognitive neuroscience, partly philosophy, particularly metaphysics. And partly it's what I've learned from a very long career from amazing colleagues, and most of all, from what I've learned from my patients, which is the equivalent to your mediation clients. Now, if anything proves insightful or helpful, then they should get the credit. If anything's rubbish, it's my fault. Just like marriage. Okay, so I started putting ideas together for this talk on the meaning of life in the meaningless universe, and had so much material that I kept refining it and cutting it back until I got to just over an hour. Then I realized that I can't in any way be comprehensive. So I'm just picking a couple of subjects. And I'll tell you what I've left out. I've left out the evolution of the brain up to the Stone Age and how the huge changes in our behavior and thinking since then have been due to culture, in other words, memes rather than genes. I'm not going to talk about determinism, and in particular, theological determinism, which is an interesting phenomenon. Nor am I going to talk about the illusion of consciousness and the undoubted delusion of free will another day. I'm not going to talk about how human brains and the brains of higher animals have innate moral values. We're born with moral values, although these, of course, are molded by our life experiences. And these moral values vary from person to person, and we know a lot about why they vary. And of course, our values, what's important in our lives, what we think is right and wrong, has a big implication on how we find meaning in lives. I've taken out the fact that our brains can only handle information as part of a narrative. It's the only way we understand them. And that's why when scientists give us unemotional, bare facts with graphs and charts, they cannot compete with a strong emotional narrative from the climate deniers or the anti-vaxxers. I was going to cover a subject dear to my heart, the importance of love. And the greatest of these, caritas, agape, what C.S. Lewis called the greatest of the four loves. And of course, without love, I am just a sounding brass or a tinkling cymbal. Great literature. I won't talk about the nature of empathy and how empathy varies from person to person and how we can measure measure empathy and look at the factors that influence it. I won't talk about how we can actually enhance epilepsy, particularly in people who aren't naturally empathic. And even in people who are naturally empathic, and I think probably people who choose to become mediators are naturally empathic, we can lose empathy when we're stressed, overwrought, or drunk. Empathy flies out the window. I'm not going to discuss how death and the afterlife have fueled our constant search for meaning. So that's what you're missing. Subjects for another day. Here, I'm fishing for a repeat performance. So what I am going to talk about is firstly spirituality, a doctor's take on it, and then I'm going to tell you the meaning of life. That may be quite short. Okay, so spirituality in the health sciences is a really big deal. It occurs in every document. Don't forget the spirituality. But I'm not at all happy with this word. I'm not quite sure what people mean by it. And I don't really like the word spirituality. It's a bit like spiritualism, and of course implies spirits. I also feel it's a lazy word. I'm sure you know what I mean. a word that people just dump everything into. Anything you don't quite understand or a bit weird or a bit touchy-feely, it's spiritual. Okay, that's it's sort of almost put into that bag and then not analyzed further. Some people even suggest spirituality cannot be described, that it's ineffable. Now, the great Ludwig Wittgenstein, in his last words of Tractatus, said, "Woran man nicht sprechen kann, darüber muss man schweigen." You all speak German. Basically, that you cannot speak of, you must remain silent, which makes sense. I mean, if you can't speak about something, then you do have a problem in discussing it. So let's deconstruct spirituality and think about what it means, because I think people use it in different senses. A very straightforward sense is that it involves the sort of psychological suffering apart from physical suffering. So anything, sadness and grieving and anger and apathy, things you all see in people who are divorcing or going through traumas in their life, whether they're facing the end of life or whether they're facing the end of a marriage. Divorce can sometimes seem worse than death. And of course, these psychological problems are handled in the usual way. You know, you've got interventional treatment in a psychiatrist, psychology, drugs. You've got permissive and supportive treatment, counselors, pastoral care, possibly mediators. Not treating people, but you're nudging people, aren't you? You're always trying to get them off the record going round and round and round, which is destroying their thinking, let alone their lives. And then it's just informal befriending. Now, these are all really important, but I don't call these spirituality. I just call this psychology. And I don't think the form of psychology in these situations is qualitatively different from any other. But there is one aspect of the end of life, and I guess the end of life, a period of transition, that is different. And that's the sort of existential angst, the ultimate given that there is an end to a life, or in this case, a life-changing divorce. These events concentrate our mind and lead us to ask big questions. So what's it all about? Now, for an existential philosophy, that includes the nature of man, the space existence of God, the afterlife, why rather than how, purpose rather than mechanism, and the meaning of life. Now, you can call these things spiritual, but actually, since the ancient Greeks, we've had a perfectly good name for it, and it's referred to as metaphysics, trying to answer the big question. And I will be trying to answer one of those a bit later. Now, as a doctor, often dealing with people with terrible diseases, that they have to follow a journey that is frightening for them and uncertain. And I join them on their journey. I don't push them, pull them, I walk with them. Both of us looking ahead, not at each other, looking at the terrain. So I'm putting myself in their shoes. And sometimes they say, "Doctor, what is death? Is there an afterlife? What's the meaning of life, doctor?" Now, you know, this is great. I think, I'm really looking forward to this conversation. It's just the sort of conversation I like. So what do? I say, that's a very interesting question. Very interesting. Why did you ask it? And that is the correct response. Because usually they don't want a big intellectual chat, which I would like. What they want to do is say, well, you know, I often regret this, or I've been thinking about that. And they talk about their fears, their bewilderment, their sense of loss, all the what ifs. And I can support them in those when I walk on the journey with them. Sometimes people say, well, doc, I've got cancer. You know, I'm only 60, I've had a good life, and they tell me I'm going to die now. What's all that about? Why? Why me? It's so ruddy unfair. What do I do with them? Do I say, I'll get the chaplain to come and talk to you? And for chaplains, people of religious faith, the chaplain can be very helpful indeed, because religion will help them, their faith will help them make sense of what's happening. And it may help them with making difficult decisions, even ethical decisions. And not just them, the doctors and nurses as well. And we call that bit religion, okay? But for better or worse, 53% of the population say they have no religion. 70% of young people have no religion. And this may surprise you, of the people who say, I am a Christian, I belong to the Christian faith, over 50%, when questioned, say they don't believe that Jesus was a real person who died, came back to life, and was the Son of God, which is the sine qua non for, that's the minimum you have to believe to be a Christian. But they derive great comfort from their religious faith, and they're cultural Christians. I'm actually a cultural Christian. I love all things related to churches and church music, and there's a church just over there, St. Chad's, fantastic vicaress, Lady Vicar. And I pop in and listen to her sermons, and then I sneak out again. And she's always teasing me about that. She says, I'm trying to get the benefit without the hard work, which I think is interesting. Anyway, so how do you address existential angst in people who don't have the benefit of religious faith? The benefit in that when they're dying, they know at the end of the day that there is an all-compassionate, all-loving God, that in a sense, everything that happens is part of God's plan. And when they die, they will go somewhere truly wonderful. It'll make the problems with this life seem like nothing. Wonderful, wonderful, comforting ideas if you believe them. But what about the 53% who don't believe? It's doable, but it's not easy. And that's why I've trained as a quite considerable training, both in generic chaplaincy and in humanist chaplaincy, so that I can do that. I'll talk more about that later if you want. Now we come on to, I think, is the most interesting aspects of spirituality, and that is the spiritual experience. Now, this actually is rather different from all the other things I've been talking about, and the spiritual experience doesn't actually have much to do with medicine per se, or with mediation, but it's the most interesting thing, so we'll talk about it. Okay. I've got notes here, so I don't bang on too long. Okay, so we all recognize these wonderful feelings. I get it when I walk around a wonderful cathedral, a majestic Islamic building, the Taj Mahal or the Alhambra, and I get it with many varieties of religious art and music. For these move all of us, whether we have faith or not. What one feels at these times is not just more intense, but of a different quality. There's a feeling of transcendence, a feeling of awe and wonder. Explain. When I look at a beautiful object, I feel good. The more beautiful, the better I feel. But sometimes a thing of beauty, like I remember Michelangelo's Pieta in a rather dark part of the cathedral, but with light lit up. I sense something profound, not just for that beautiful sculpture, but for the whole world about me and my own small place in it. And this is common. This is very common with religious art, which after all is designed to give you a tingle factor. But it also occurs with secular art and with nature. I remember a rainbow on a mellow autumn afternoon that so moved me that I felt in my heart that it's just wonderful to be alive. Two people meet and grow fond of each other. They like each other more and more, and then liking becomes love. And everything changes. Their love becomes weirdly generalized. It's not only the partner that they see through rose-tinted glasses, but the whole world seems transformed by love. So blinded by love that Ken ignores the fact that Barbie is a QAnon Trump supporter, and Barbie can't see what's obvious to all of us, that Ken is gay. But love blinds them to that. These are common problems, common experiences in the general population. Some more than others, but we all get these wonderful factors, sometimes in full flood, sometimes just a tinkle factor, sometimes predictably, a particular piece of music. There's some particular arias in La Traviata that, ooh, I just love it. I just wait for that little bit of music. Over 100 years ago, William James, I don't know if you've heard of William James, he was the brother of Henry James, the author, and I think a much more important man, a philosopher and a psychologist. And he gave these lectures, different lectures on the varieties of religious experience. And he talked a lot about the phenomenology of religious experience, in particular spiritual experiences. He says they have four main characteristics. One is that they seem to be difficult to describe, ineffable, that there's a noetic quality. The mystical state carries a sense of higher knowledge, intense insight into something incredibly important, but often inexplicable. The states are usually transient. They don't go on for long. If they go on for long, they're usually part of some disturbed psychological process, not infrequently psychosis. And they also have a sense of passivity. You feel as though your own will is in abeyance, and some people even feel they've been grasped by something higher than themselves. So these are very common features of spiritual experience. And also Alistair Hardy, you may know Alistair Hardy, who had a centre for spiritual experiences in Lampeter, not so far from here, dead now, but much more recent than William James. And also, as well as the phenomenology that these people looked into, we now know that religious experiences, spiritual experiences, are not something otherworldly. Yeah. Now, we know this from a whole body, large body of research experience. I'm not saying all experiences. There may be some coming from out there. I'm prepared to concede that. But we know that from functional MRI scanning, brain stimulation experiments, and a lot of other work, that the brain is involved. A more modern neuroscientist, Andrew Neuberg, has done phenomenological studies, and he's shown that, not dissimilar to William James, there's a sense of intensity, which he attributes to activity in the amygdala, clarity, tense clarity. Suddenly you see everything clearly, almost like an autochthonous delusion that schizophrenics get. And that's from the thalamus, sense of unity. Everybody is one, everybody's bound together. I'm part of a mysterious whole, from the parietal lobes, and a sense of surrender. And he also talks about experience being transformative. This is rather like what the great psychiatrist at the Maudsley, William Sargent, talked about, transmarginal inhibition, where people fall down in a trance and afterwards experience a religious conversion, usually an extreme one, from Jewish to Christian or something like that. Not just, oh, I think I might be a Christian. And this is described elsewhere. Sudden and extreme religious conversion is sometimes seen after seizures, particularly those originating in the temporal lobes. A present-day example is Karen Armstrong. Have any of you read books by Karen Armstrong? They're long, but they are good. And you know, she was a nun in a closed order who started getting epilepsy and became an atheist, for better or worse. And also you've got to think about some of the epileptic saints who converted during seizures. And maybe there was one on the way to Damascus, who knows? Doesn't actually describe it that well in Acts. So this propensity to religious experiences, spiritual experiences, has been well studied. But what's less well studied is the mystical experience. Now, the mystical experience, we know, can be produced by stimulation of the temporal lobe, drugs, extreme physiological conditions such as extreme exercise, fasting, prolonged meditation, but can occur naturally and spontaneously, but it's much rarer. It's much more idiosyncratic than the generalized sort of spiritual dimension I was talking before. Whether mystical experiences and spiritual experiences and just intense emotional experiences are on a sort of continuous spectrum, whether they are qualitatively discrete is debated. I personally think they are so phenomenologically distinct and possibly neurologically distinct, but I would say they're separate entities, and they're easier to understand that way. Now, psychologists have studied spirituality and religiosity, and they've developed scales that are valid, reproducible scales for showing whether somebody's a spiritual person, whether they feel a spiritual experiences easily or not at all. And like all biological variables, they are part of a normal distribution. You know, that bell-shaped curve. Most people in the middle, sort of fairly spiritual. Some people intensely spiritual. Some people have great difficulty or never ever achieve a spiritual experience, which I seems a great shame. Now, if there's a variation in the population, there must be a reason for this. And the reasons can only be one of two things. Either it's in your genes, nature, or it's in your environment, nurture. And you can distinguish between those. And a number of very robust studies based on concordance and twins has shown that both religiosity and spirituality, the variation of them in the population is about 40% attributable to your genes. That's not surprising. If your parents tend to be happy people, you're happy people. If they're angry people, you tend to be angry. You know, these are inherited traits, not just the way you're brought up. And we know this because they occur just as equally in people brought up by other people. Anyway, that's a talk for another day, but that's interesting. Now, I'll ask you this. Does it matter? Does it matter that you don't have to be religious to experience these wonderful transcendental feelings? Does it matter that a beautiful, moving rainbow can actually be experienced by, you know, refraction of light in droplets of water? Does it matter that neuroscientists have shown that many of our feelings, including the appreciation of great art, pleasure, love, ecstasy, and tingle factors, are the result of electrochemical changes in here? Does it matter that spiritual experiences may be mediated by oxytocin? Does it matter that psychedelic drugs can produce a transcendental experience, as can electrical stimulation of the temporal lobes? Does it matter that the temporal lobe damage can result in hyper-religiosity and sometimes ecstatic religious conversion? Does it matter that the awe and wonder, the transcendental experience, is in here and not out there? Does it matter that to some degree my spiritual experience is the product of my genes? None of these matter. None of these matter at all. None of these diminish my joy when I experience transcendental wonder, for it is part of what it is to be human, as is our consciousness, our free will, our innate moral sense, and our compassion and love for others. Some people experience these moments of wonder more easily than others. Some train their minds to feel transcendence by contemplation, by prayer, by meditation, occasionally by drugs. But the sense of wonder about the world and the awe we feel in the presence of great art and the majesty of nature, these experiences are available to all of us, regardless of our faith or lack of it. So, when you're next watching a sunset, enjoying great art, or close to someone you love, let the experience take over. Open your mind to wonder and awe and oxytocin. For what goes on in here is the greatest show on earth, and it's free. That is the end of the first half. Your end of the first lesson. So that's spirituality. Don't know how long it took. Not that long. I thought we might discuss that. I've said some things